Okay, first, just a word about the title. Leviathan, we'll talk more about this tomorrow, but Leviathan was a book by a guy named Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. And it was about the idea that the king should control everything in society. He should be over every area of life, including religion and that kind of thing. And so the idea of Leviathan is a government that extends its tentacles into everything, into every part of life. And as it turns out, when you take a look at the way Christianity has thought about government over the years, that's not what the church has said. The church has always been about limiting the power of government. It's always been about slaying Leviathan, because Leviathan is the natural form of government. Government will always extend its power out into every area. And we see this throughout history. We see this across cultures. We see this everywhere. The idea that government shouldn't do that is actually a product of Christianity. So what we're going to talk about today is how we got there, how this develops. Hopefully we'll get through the Middle Ages, and then tomorrow we'll pick up with the Protestant Reformation, bringing it up through the 18th century for reasons which we'll understand better tomorrow, and show how a lot of these ideas that start in the early church and go through the Middle Ages, combine with some new insights out of Protestantism to actually lead to things like the American Revolution and the Constitution. Okay, so that's generally where we're going. So let's put up a slide here. Let's go to the next one. All right, when we're talking about government, really the place we need to start is with Jesus' own words about it. And in Matthew 22, we have the incident where the Pharisees come to Jesus and they're trying to lay a trap for him. They say, is it legal to pay taxes to Caesar? Now, this is a no-win question. They figure they've got him here, because if he says yes, the people who really hated being under Rome will turn against Jesus because it sounds like he's a collaborator. If he says no, he's actually advocating not paying taxes to the Roman government, which means he's a rebel and a traitor and he'll be executed. So this is a no-win situation. But as usual, Jesus works his way through it. He says, okay, show me a coin. Whose image is on it? By the way, that's going back to Genesis. People are made in the image of God. It's also going back to the second commandment, don't make a graven image. Whose image is on it? Well, it's Caesar's. And so Jesus says, okay, give to Caesar what's Caesar's and give to God what's God's. And at that point, they're flabbergasted. They just don't know what to do with it and they walk away. Actually, it says they're afraid to ask him any more questions after that. Now, why am I starting here? Jesus' statement gives us a couple of important insights into government. One of them is that there are things that legitimately belong to Caesar. In other words, there are things that are legitimately the responsibility of government. There are things that we legitimately owe the government. But that's not everything. There are things that we owe to God, at the very least, and as it turns out, as we'll see, there are things that we owe other people too. So the government has its own legitimate authority, but that authority doesn't extend to everything. And so the key question, well, God determines which is which. God determines what the government, what belongs to the government and what doesn't. So the key question we need to be asking as we're looking at the role of government is, does this thing, whatever this is that something that belongs to Caesar or isn't it? Now, what this does automatically, just the very question and the answer that Jesus gives, what it does is it sets up the principle that government is limited. That there are things that do not belong to Caesar. And And as we're moving forward, the question, what does and does not belong to Caesar, is going to be one that we will keep coming back to, if not in those words, then sort of by implication. So this is where we've got to start. And as we're thinking about government, and as we're thinking about what our response to government as Christians should be, as we're thinking about what our response to potential legislation or anything else, the first question we should be asking is, does this belong to Caesar? It's a question we never think to ask, but it's where we really always need to start. Okay, so next slide. Now, in the early church, what you find happening is that the most basic creedal statement in the early church, the most basic statement of faith, is, well, it's two words in Greek, Christos Kyrios, or in English, Christ is Lord, Jesus is Lord. That is the core confession of the Christian church. What we miss when we say Jesus is Lord is that when that confession was made in the early church, it was an inescapably political statement. Because in the Roman Empire, the de facto confession of faith in the Roman Empire is Caesar is Lord. What do I mean by that? In the empire, Leviathan ruled. The government extended to everything. Caesar was the supreme authority in the political realm, but the political realm extended into almost all of life. And that included religion. So in the Roman Empire, in the Roman world, the concept of what a god was, this is not capital G, this is small g, lowercase g. The concept of a god was someone who was the supreme authority in a particular area of life or endeavor. So the easiest example is we take a look at, you're going to go on a sea voyage, okay? So you're going to go out on the sea. Neptune is the god of the sea. Neptune is the supreme authority over the sea. And therefore, what you want to do is you want to offer a sacrifice to Neptune, basically to say, I know I'm going into your backyard here, please don't kill me. Okay? So the gods aren't loved, they're feared. And the worship that you offer a god is essentially offering allegiance to them or acknowledging their authority so that they won't pay unnecessary attention to you. Because it's always bad when a god pays attention to you. If you actually read Homer, if a god likes you, that's trouble. Because you see, that god has other gods that don't like him. And if that god likes you, the gods that don't like him are going to make your life absolutely miserable. Okay? So you don't want the gods' attention, but by the same token, you have to at least acknowledge them so that maybe they'll ignore you. That's how they view the gods. Now, why am I telling you this? Caesar is the supreme authority in the political realm. Therefore, at times, Caesar is viewed as a god. And in order to demonstrate your allegiance to Caesar, you have to offer a sacrifice, usually burning a pinch of incense to him, to show, it's sort of like the Pledge of Allegiance in a lot of ways, but it's a religious act. Because in the Roman world, he's the supreme authority, therefore he is a god. And the Roman government, if you look at Roman law extends into pretty much every area of law we have today. The government oversees all of life. The only exception to that is family. Family was sort of families were allowed to govern themselves internally. But other than that, everything else is under the authority of the government. Everything else is under Caesar. Caesar is effectively Lord. So if you say Jesus is Lord, what you're saying is Caesar isn't. Jesus is the one who has all authority over everything, not Caesar. And because of this, the early church is persecuted. They're accused of being atheists because they don't recognize the Roman gods. They won't offer the pinch of incense. They won't perform the sacrifices. They won't do the kinds of religious rituals that are the norm for Roman society. So they're seen as disruptive. They're seen as, well, atheistic. And they're seen as disloyal because they won't acknowledge the emperor as God. They won't burn the pinch of incense. And the net result is persecution. Now, the persecution wasn't constant. It was sporadic. You get a big burst under Nero. You get bursts under several of the other emperors. Okay, so the worst persecution is under Diocletian, just a little bit before Constantine, when Constantine legalizes Christianity. It was known as the Great Persecution, and, well, it was awful. It was actually worse than what occurred under Nero. Okay, so that's the early church. Notice again, though, that there is like I said, an inescapably political implication to the basic confession that Jesus is Lord. Because what it is doing is it's saying that there is someone who is supreme over the emperor himself, and thus that the emperor does not have all authority. There's authority that goes beyond what he has. Okay, next slide. Now, the early Christians were constantly trying to make the argument that, look, we aren't dangerous, we're not atheists. They were defending their beliefs. They actually went so far as to sort of attack pagan beliefs too at times. But as early as the 2nd century, they began making an argument for religious liberty. And that argument went like this. Worship that is compelled, that is forced, is not pleasing to God. The only worship that's pleasing to God is worship that is offered to him voluntarily. Therefore, you have to allow religious liberty. Whatever you think of God, you have to allow religious liberty in order for the worship to truly be voluntary. Like I said, that's an argument that's going back to the early 100s with Tertullian. Well, then along comes this guy named Lactantius, a couple of centuries later, century and a half later. Lactantius was a Christian, and he was hired by Constantine while Constantine was still a pagan. He was hired by Constantine to be a tutor for Constantine's children. So Constantine brings on this Christian to teach his children. And he wrote this book called The Divine Institutes. He's doing some, he's an advisor to Constantine and so on. But in The Divine Institutes, he repeats Tertullian's argument for religious liberty. You have to have religious liberty because the only worship that's acceptable to God is given to him voluntarily. Now, Constantine will end up converting in the year 312. There's a battle at a place called Milvian Bridge where, according to the accounts we have, he had a vision of a Christian symbol, a Chi-Rho, and with the words, "In this sign conquer." And he had his troops painted on their shields, and they went into the battle and they won. And that's what made Constantine really the sole emperor, pretty much. The next year in 313, he issues the Edict of Milan. And now the Edict of Milan is pretty commonly misunderstood. People will tell you that at that point, Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the empire, sort of like giving it a Nike swoosh or something. That's not what it did. What it did is it repeated Lactantius's words from the Divine Institutes, that since the only worship that's acceptable to God is given to him voluntarily, there must be religious liberty. Therefore, we are proclaiming religious liberty in the empire. Nothing is illegal unless it is seriously disruptive, socially disruptive. And so that has the effect of decriminalizing Christianity. And so Christianity now becomes a legal religion in the empire. Constantine himself converts. There's some debate over that, but I think the weight of the argument really goes toward him actually converting. And at that point, we have a situation where, well, things have changed substantially for the church in Rome. Next slide. What this does, and people don't get this, the fact of the matter is that Christianity is the only major world religion that arose without state support. Now, if you tell people that, they're going to say, well, what about Constantine? My answer is, what about him? Because for 300 years, that's a long time. For 300 years, Christianity functioned as an illegal minority religion inside the empire. And it grew and it spread under those conditions. You can't point to any other major world religion where that's true. When Constantine decriminalizes it, he does, in fact, support the church as well. It nonetheless has established the precedent that the church can exist independently of the state. So here, for the first time, we are getting an idea of a kind of distinction between religion and government. Really, for the first time. Because up to this point, they were always, no matter where you go in the world, they're always tightly intertwined. Since the church can exist independently of the state, that has a number of implications. One of them is the state isn't actually over everything. Now, we're going back to Jesus here. Give to Caesar what's Caesar, but give to God what's God's. But this establishes an institutional or cultural or political precedent that says that this is actually the case in Rome. That the church is not under the state is not over everything. Now, where this leads, George Weigel points out that where this leads is that if you have something that is not under the authority of the state, that creates the possibility that there might be other somethings that are not under the authority of the state. In other words, it creates the possibility of other kinds of autonomous spheres, education, business, labor, science, art, whatever, that these things are not under the direct control of the government, that they can actually function quite well on their own without government interference. This is going to be the origin of the guild system in the Middle Ages, for example. It's going to be the origin of all kinds of charitable institutions, confraternities, hospitals, things like that, in the Middle Ages, that operate not under the auspices of the government, and frequently not even under the auspices of the church. The only way that happens, though, is Constantine, because of the precedent that is set that the church is independent, that the church is autonomous, that it is not under the state, it's not part of the state. It creates this possibility for all of these other things. And then this leads to what is known technically as civil society. Civil society refers to the idea that there are mediating institutions, intermediate institutions that exist between the church and the individual, so that it's not just you looking at into the eyes of the state and nothing in between. There are these other kinds of institutions, Middle Ages, guilds, hospitals, confraternities, whatever, or church, school, scientific organizations, business organizations, the labor unions, whatever. You're not directly under the authority of the state. Civil society, the essence of it is the existence of these intermediate mediating institutions. Okay. Again, that's one of these things that's unique, a unique development in Christianity because of the unique relationship that the church has to the state, because of this 300-year history of persecution. Okay, next slide. Now, when we're dealing with the Western church, the church in what we in Western Europe, in the Latin-speaking world, the key theologian, hands down, is Augustine of Hippo. And St. Augustine is important for a whole lot of different reasons. And I can't even begin to go into all of them here, but there are a few that are important for understanding the relationship with the government. Now, the first of them is that I've talked about the idea of religious liberty. And unfortunately, Augustine's contribution to this is not really positive. Augustine agreed with Lactantius and others that there should be no coercion in matters of religion when you're dealing with pagans. The question is, however, what do you do with someone who is ostensibly a Christian but has drifted off into heresy? Now, initially, he said you don't coerce them either. But then there was a group, which I'm not going to get into, called the Donatists. And the Donatists were causing a great deal of disruption, particularly in North Africa, where Augustine was. There was a church council called, and the Donatist view was condemned, and the Donatists got mad and started rioting. And so the emperor cracked down on them and basically banned them. And Augustine at this point said, well, that wouldn't be entirely appropriate with pagans, though the rioting was bad. But maybe it's okay to use some kinds of pressure on heretics to get them to head back to the church. He was against execution and things like that, but maybe fines, maybe imprisonment, something like that, might be an appropriate thing to do to bring heretics back into the fold. For the good of their souls, of course. This was, I would argue, Augustine's greatest mistake. Because in the long run, what this does is it leads to everything from witch trials to the Inquisition and actually ultimately to wars of religion. It was a serious blunder on his part and a major step backward from the earlier emphasis that had existed on religious liberty within the church. Anyway, next slide. Continuing with Augustine, one of the major theological themes you find in Augustine is the idea of original sin. In a nutshell, what this says is that everybody is corrupt and is corruptible. A sin is a constant problem. It's endemic to everybody. Now, what this means then is that the people who are in the government are also infected by original sin. The king is just as much a sinner as anybody else. The senators, the emperor, whoever, everyone in government is also corrupt and is corruptible. And what this means is government cannot be trusted with absolute power. This is again, a variant on give to Caesar what's Caesar and give to God what's God's. It's looking at it from a different direction. You can't trust Caesar with everything. And as a result, what you find coming out of Augustine is actually a system of limited government. People who are reading Augustine, and that's pretty much everybody in Western Europe, are going to insist that government needs to be limited, number one. And number two, there needs to be a system of checks and balances in place in government. We think checks and balances is sort of unique to the American Constitution. That was going on for 1,000 years or more before the US Constitution was written because of Augustine's work, because Augustine's argument about original sin, the implications of it were so clear that they figured out pretty quickly that you have to have different organizations, different systems within the government to check the power of each other so that no one got too powerful. Because if they did, original sin was going to kick in and you were going to get tyranny, corruption, and all kinds of other things. It didn't always work well. It doesn't work for us. But the principle is laid out with Augustine. And it comes to us literally through the Augustinian tradition. Again, we'll see that more tomorrow. Next slide. Augustine's most important work is a book called The City of God. The City of God argues that in this world he describes them as two cities, the city of man and the city of God. The city of man is, well, it's a system that is built around a lust for power. It is built around a drive for self-aggrandizement, to push ourselves forward. It's basically egotistical, it's full of pride, it's all of these kinds of things. and everything in it exists basically for personal self-interest. Power is exerted to force your will upon people. Government, under this system in the city of man, government is essentially a kind of organized injustice. It's just the way it is. This is because the city of man is the world, the fallen world that we all live in. And it is corrupt, and it is, it's going just completely in the wrong direction. However, in exactly the same place where the city of man exists, there's the city of God. They're not two different locations. They intermingle. And in the city of God operates very differently from the city of man. The city of God is built around love. It is built around self-sacrifice. Its tools are things like penitence, mercy, forgiveness, as opposed to brute force. It is, in essence, the people of God who are actually living as the people of God, living according to the standards of King Jesus and his kingdom. Now, the interesting thing is that although these two cities are they're going in diametrically opposite directions, they have diametrically opposite goals and purposes and everything else, nonetheless, they can cooperate. So, for example, in the city of man, the great virtue in the city of man is tolerance. And the reason why tolerance is important is that tolerance maintains peace in the sense of an absence of conflict, an absence of hostility, things like that, which is important if you want to maintain your power. So, tolerance, peace in the sense of lack of conflict, all of those kinds of things are things that the city of man wants to promote. Ironically enough, if you violate them, they crack down on you really hard with violence. But other than that, they generally want to, this is their goal. Why? Because it increases their own power, their own glory, and everything else. It keeps stability. It keeps the status quo in place so that the people in power stay in power. The city of God also values peace, but for completely different reasons. It values peace because Jesus is the Prince of Peace. It values peace because in the context of peace, the gospel can be spread. So they can cooperate in trying to promote peace in the city, even though their motivations are radically different. So there are ways that the city of God and city of man can work together, even though they're very, very different. Now, Augustine argued that this is the fundamental state of society with as long as there are Christians in society, both of these cities are operative. A pope came along by the name of Gelasius I. He was the last of the North African popes. And Gelasius, reading the city of God, made a fateful error. He said that the city of man is the government and the city of God is the church. That's not what Augustine said. Augustine pointed out that there are many people who are true Christians who are not in the church, and there are many people who are in the church who are not true Christians. He didn't see this in institutional terms. He saw it in spiritual terms, in terms of maybe individuals, something like that, but not in institutional terms. Gelasius, by doing this, changes essentially Augustine's argument in some pretty important ways that's going to set up the conflicts that are going to be occurring in Europe for the next 1100 years. Now, the City of God, by the way, is arguably one of the most important books in the world. You'd have to look at something like, well, the Bible, of course, the Quran, maybe Confucius Analects. There aren't many other books that have had the impact that the City of God did. And arguably, the City of God may be ahead of Confucius here. The City of God shaped the way Western Europe saw itself for the next 1,300 years. There are very few books that have that kind of civilizational impact. This is huge. And again, unfortunately, some of that gets filtered through the Pope's misreading of it. Okay, let's move on. Now here we've got to do at least a brief history lesson. I should note, I'm throwing out a lot of threads here. You're going to see them tied together as we move forward. I just have to get a lot of the pieces on the board before you can see their interaction here. Now, just to do a very brief rundown of about 700 years of history. In the Roman Empire, in the western half of the Roman Empire especially, the Latin-speaking half of the empire, the Roman administration fell apart. It just collapsed. And there are a whole lot of different reasons for this, which I'm not going to get into, though I will mention one of my favorites, which is climate change. Yeah, it happens. Yeah, I'm not going to go further with that. Anyway, as the Roman Empire, as Roman administration across the empire collapses, somebody has to try to pick up the pieces. Somebody's got to try to hold things together. And the last man standing in most areas was the bishop. So the net result is bishops in the cities began taking on more and more administrative roles that prior to this had been done by Roman officials, because somebody's got to do it. And the Roman officials weren't there anymore. Bishops were educated. In areas where Germanic tribes moved in, the local warlords weren't educated. So the bishops are really the key people in all of this. Now, what happens during the period from about 500 roughly to 1000, which in America we call the early Middle Ages, in England they call the Dark Ages. Dark because there's very little written source material for the period, so it's historically dark, you can't see into it. During this period, what you see is decentralized government. Government gets pushed to lower and more local levels. You have kings and things like that, but the kings tend to be very weak. They tend to be weaker, in fact, than some of the nobles that are under them. So government becomes decentralized and far more localized. The papacy is weak, and at times it is incredibly corrupt. The papacy became little more than a political football in a lot of ways that was kicked between Roman families. There was actually a period of time which was referred to as the papal pornocracy, which literally translates to government by prostitution. And the reason for that was that there was, in fact, a woman who had been a prostitute who became the mistress and mother of several popes and pulled a lot of strings. Probably my favorite example, I hadn't planned on doing this one, probably my favorite example from this period, though, involved something called the Cadaver Synod. In the Cadaver Synod, there had been a pope by the name of Formosus, and after he died, his successor really didn't like him. He was sort of a rival and enemy of him. And so he had Formosus dug up, put in papal robes, and sat in a chair and put him on trial for heresy. Formosus didn't give an effective defense. And so he was condemned, stripped of his robes, and his body was thrown in the Tiber. When that pope died, his successor said, well, this was a crock, and he fished Formosus's body out of the Tiber and reinstated him and put him back in his tomb. That's the kind of nonsense that's going on with the papacy. Okay, so you got decentralized government. You have a papacy that's really, frankly, in disarray. The only exception to this is a period under Charlemagne. Not going to say much about that, but Charlemagne manages to centralize power. He manages to actually do a lot of things with church reform and things like that. But then he dies and things fall apart pretty quickly. Well, somewhere around the late 10th century, when Charlemagne had gotten the title of emperor, Within a generation or two, that title they stopped using it because there was nobody that actually had enough power to really qualify as an emperor. Well, in the late 10th century, Otto the First of Saxony is going to actually manage to consolidate enough power in Germany and then move down into Italy that they decide he deserves the title of emperor. So he was named emperor, and then he went down to Rome and found the popes were, well, not doing their job. So he deposed the pope and appointed a new one, actually a very good candidate. He was succeeded, Otto I was succeeded by his son, Otto II, who was succeeded by his son, Otto III. They were kind of creative with their names. The dynasty is known as the Ottonians for obvious reasons. And all of them were interested in church reform. All of them were deposing popes and appointing good candidates in place of the ones that they had to get rid of. And the effect of this is it led to a revival of the papacy. Suddenly, the popes are taking their job seriously. They're seeing themselves actually as genuine spiritual leaders. And they're getting kind of upset at these emperors who are busy deposing popes and appointing new ones. They want the papacy to be independent of the state again. So what you see first is a political revival, political centralization beginning to occur. Oh, by the way, that was fueled by climate change. It got colder and wetter toward the end of the Roman Empire. Now it's getting warmer and drier. It's got huge implications. But in any event, you get the imperial revival first. That leads to the papal revival. And once you get the papal revival, they're busy, like I said, trying to get themselves independent. And you start getting a real tug of war occurring now between the Pope and the emperor and later kings. Next slide. The real issue ends up being who is as they put it, the leader of the Christian world, sort of ignoring the fact that you've got the entire Byzantine Empire that's Christian and isn't involved in this discussion at all. But at least within Western Europe, who's the leader of what they saw as the Christian world? This leads to something called the investiture controversy. Investiture is when you give, in this case, a bishop, the symbols of his office. It's what you really install him in his office. You give him a staff called a crozier, you see that there, and a ring. And these are the symbols of the office. Who has the right to give the bishop the symbols of his office? The emperor said, these guys are part of my administration. I need loyal people, I get to appoint them, and I get to install them. The Pope said, no, bishops are primarily church officers, therefore we appoint them and we install them. And this turns into a knockdown, drag-out fight. The Pope deposes the emperor deposes the Pope, the emperor invades Italy, there are wars, all kinds of things like this. It ends finally in 1122, the investiture controversy does. But there's ongoing tension between popes and kings or the Holy Roman Emperor all the way into the 1500s, all the way actually into Luther's era. The last time a Holy Roman Emperor invaded Rome in a war against the Pope was in 1526, 9 years after the 95 Theses. Okay, so this is an ongoing issue. It's a tug of war over where the balance of power lies between church and state. Next slide. Now, the justification for this, each side had its own set of arguments. The papacy's argument was based around what they called the doctrine of the two swords. It said that God gave two swords to the world. There's the sword of the church and the sword of the state. The sword of the church is God's most direct rule on earth, the Pope being his vicar, his representative on earth. The sword of the state has to be wielded under the authority of the church. So what this is saying is that the church is superior to the state. The state's job is to enforce righteousness in the world. That's why God gave it the sword. But only the church, only the Pope has the right to determine what righteousness is. So this is an argument for the superiority of the church over the state. It's called the doctrine of the two swords. We'll see two kingdoms, Luther's response to this, next time. Another way of framing this argument is the eternal is superior to the temporal, temporal having to do with time. The spiritual is superior to the physical, therefore the church is superior to the state. And therefore the Pope is superior to the emperor. It's another way of framing the argument. It's a variant, the two swords is a variant on that. Now, in response to this, the Holy Roman Emperor says, no. The church has jurisdiction, yes, but it has jurisdiction in religious matters. Its job is people's souls, and it has jurisdiction over the means of grace, the sacraments, preaching, souls, things like that. It has no jurisdiction in this world. Church is purely spiritual matters. Everything else is in the hands of the state, is in the hands of the emperor. Okay. That's their argument. As a matter of fact, some of these guys went so far as to say that the church could not even own property in this world. They had to live in absolute poverty. Because if they're owning property, they're taking a degree of authority in the secular realm, which is outside their jurisdiction. So that's the imperial argument. And that, interestingly enough, is supported by one of the religious orders, the Franciscans, largely because the Franciscans believed in the idea of apostolic poverty. That is to say that Christ and the apostles owned nothing, and therefore, if you were going to follow their example in the church, you should own nothing. We'll see a little bit more of that in a bit. Okay, so this issue of church and state is becoming, well, it's an ongoing problem in the Middle Ages, and arguably it continues to be a problem today. This is, again, it's not discussed often in political science classes, but arguably since the year 400 or so, maybe 500, this issue of how you balance church and state has been an ongoing theme in Western political thought. And we're seeing sort of an extreme example here, but I think if you just look at our current political situation, you can see it continues to have relevance. When we get to the Reformation, we're going to see a major change in this for a lot of reasons, which we'll get to tomorrow. Okay, so in any event, let's move on. Now, at this point, I need to bring up an ancient Greek thinker by the name of Aristotle. Augustine shaped a lot of thinking about government in the Middle Ages. Government must be limited, you must have checks and balances because government is corrupt. It's coming out of the city of God where government is essentially organized oppression, okay, organized injustice. There's this negative view of government there. On the other hand, starting in about the 12th century, Western Europeans began to recover a lot of works by Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher. These were coming to them through Muslim Spain, and the medieval world by the 12th century had developed a worldview that some scholars call Platonic humanism. The idea is that the world came from God, therefore studying the world can lead you back to God. They already had a way of understanding the world, but there were a lot of philosophical questions that they were still asking, that they were still wrestling with. And when they found Aristotle, they found a guy who had an entire coherent system of thought that addressed all of their key philosophical questions. So Aristotle, hits like a bomb on the intellectual life of Europe. He becomes the in thing. He was referred to as the master of those who know. Master means teacher. The master of those who know. If you want to know anything about anything, Aristotle's your guy. That was more or less how he was viewed. Now, his works on politics came out during this period as well. Those were also recovered and translated into Latin. And Aristotle had a very different view of government than Augustine did. He said that government existed in nature, it was part of the world, it was part of nature, and therefore it could perform a positive role. Now, he wasn't stupid. He knew that governments could be evil, but he had a much more positive view of the potential of government than what you see in Augustine. And so as you're working through medieval political thought in more detail, what you see is a dialectic, a balance, a dialogue going on constantly between Augustine and Aristotle, trying to figure out, okay, yeah, we can't exactly trust government, but how do you make a government that works? How do you make a government that's positive? There's got to be a way of doing it. Aristotle says there is. So we've got to be able to find a way of having a positive vision of government while avoiding the problems that Augustine defined. Now, one way of looking at this is through Aristotle's typology of government. He said that there are basically three kinds of government, and these exist in both a good and a corrupt form. The first of them is monarchy. Monarchy is a positive thing. It means literally rule by one. Okay? So monarchy is you have a king who is the sole ruler and he decides everything. Monarchies have a tremendous advantage in that in an emergency, the king can make quick decisions. And so you can act decisively when you need to. Of course, the problem is if the king makes a mistake, there's nothing to buffer it. So if the king makes a mistake, it can be disastrous. So that's the weakness in monarchy. Now, when a monarchy goes corrupt, it turns into a tyranny. A tyranny occurs when the king is not ruling for the good of the people, but for his own self-interest. Okay, so that's the key thing. A tyranny operates just like a monarchy, ruled by a single individual, but whereas the monarch is working for the good of the state, the good of the people, the tyrant is working only for pure self-interest. The second form of government, good form, is aristocracy. This is a rule by literally the best. Okay, so what you have is a council, frequently of elders, the Roman Senate, for example. Senate comes from the word senex, meaning an old man. So it's worth noting that senator is cognate to senile. So you have a council of elders that is a deliberative body. That is to say, they discuss and debate what should be done in any particular situation. The advantage to an aristocracy is they're less prone to mistakes than a monarchy is. The disadvantage is it can take so long to reach a decision that in an emergency, you can be paralyzed and not act when you need to. So again, pluses and minuses. A degenerate aristocracy is an oligarchy ruled by a few. And essentially, the relationship between oligarchy and aristocracy is the same as tyranny to monarchy. In an oligarchy, the small group of people that run things are running them for self-interest out of their own, lining their own pockets, their own self-interest, their own power and all of that, rather than for the good of the state. So it's essentially the same kind of problem you see between monarchy and tyranny. Your third form of government in Aristotle, in its positive form, is a republic. A republic is rule by representation. In a republic, it is a representative government. And the great advantage of a republic is you get buy-in from the people. Okay? You're much more likely to support the government, even if the government ends up doing something you don't want them to do, if you feel that you at least had a voice in it. Your representative spoke for you. Okay? So the republic brings in, like I said, a lot of buy-in. Now, by the way, when I talk about representation, that does not necessarily mean one person, one vote. There are a lot of ways you can get representation. In medieval cities, for example, which were typically republics, representation was by guilds. The heads of the guilds were the representative for the guild on the city councils. So it's not necessarily the way we think of representation through, one person, one vote, or elections or things like that. There are a lot of ways you can get there. But the key thing is representation somehow. To Aristotle, the degenerate form of republic is democracy. Democracy is not rule by representation, it's direct rule by the people, the demoi in Greek. And demoi might mean the people, but it carries with it the implication of the mob, the rabble. And Aristotle had direct experience with this. You know, we always tout Athenian democracy, how wonderful it was. Aristotle saw it at its worst. You know, there was a war where, I think it was the Peloponnesian War, where an Athenian general lost a battle and the people were so mad at him, they ordered him to be executed. And he was, because the will of the people goes. If the will of the people says one thing one day and something else the next, it shifts. The real problem for Aristotle with seeing democracy in action is the danger of the rise of a demagogue. Again, the Greek roots mean a mob ruler, a leader of the mob, a leader of the people in the sense of the mob, the rabble. This is someone who would inflame the passions of the people. You know, a good speaker, a good rhetorician, something like that, who could inflame the passions of the people and get them to act with emotion rather than reason. And since emotions are fickle and changeable and things like that, and frequently do not act in accordance with reason or justice, democracies are disastrous. And like I said, Aristotle saw this. He was an Athenian. He knew this firsthand from the history of his own city. So next time someone talks to you about the virtues of democracy, ask them what they mean. Okay. So in any event, the ideal that comes out of this is the idea of a mixed government. What do I mean by that? A mixed government is a government that combines elements of two or all three of these in a single system. So you see in the Middle Ages, a king has a council. The king is monarchy, the council is an aristocracy. Medieval cities, I already told you, are republics, but they frequently also have a strong aristocratic element to them in that the cities were run by a number of different councils. The smaller the council, the more elite the council, the more power it had. So you would have an aristocracy operating within the context of a republic. So they deliberately tried to mix different types of government in so that the strengths of one would outweigh the weaknesses of another. This is really important. This is a preview of coming attractions. The people who wrote our Constitution knew their Aristotle. They knew Aristotle's politics. And when they set up the federal government, what did they do? The monarchical principle is embodied in the president. The aristocratic principle is embodied in the Senate. And the House of Representatives is, by definition, Republican. They set up our federal government as an Aristotelian mixed state. Okay. So this stuff has got kind of long-term implications even for today. And actually, you'll follow the same kind of thing you see in state governments. Not so much in local, but at state governments, you see the same kind of structure in place. Okay, so next slide. So, oh, by the way, Augustine fits in with Aristotle because Augustine explains how you get from column A to column B. How does a monarchy degenerate to a tyranny, an aristocracy to an oligarchy, a republic to a democracy? Original sin. Okay, anyway. Now, last piece of the puzzle for the Middle Ages is the idea of natural rights. Natural rights are rights that are given to us by God. That's the key thing. And they are therefore unalienable, which means they cannot be taken away or, for that matter, given up. Since God gave us these rights, only God is the only one who can take them away or do anything about them. They are completely, since they are completely God-given, they are not under anyone's authority, not ours, not anybody else's, not the government's. This is why, by the way, Jefferson talks about we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. They're given by God. and therefore they are not under the purview of government. Okay, now, there are 3 of them that are mentioned in medieval theologians. And some of them go back even earlier. The Roman Empire talked about some of these as well, some of the Roman legal theorists. The first of these is life. Okay. Again, it should be kind of obvious. God is the one who gave us life in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, God and only God has authority over our life in that sense. This means that since life is given to us by God, it is our responsibility to do everything in our power to preserve it, our own and other people's. Now, you find medieval jurists who go to rather large extremes when they're discussing this. So, for example, they will say things like, all right, suppose you are a condemned criminal and you are going to be executed. You have, therefore, a responsibility to attempt to escape, to do everything in your power to escape, short of killing your jailer. Why? Because life is an unalienable right and you don't have a right to give it up. And you must do everything in your power to preserve it. Similarly, if a person is starving and comes to you for bread, you have a moral obligation to give it to him. If you do not give it to him, he has at least the right and perhaps a moral obligation to steal it, to preserve his life. Okay, this is the degree to which, when I say you must preserve it, this is the degree that we're talking about here. Now, there are some hard cases that come up, the death penalty being an obvious one. Now, the short answer on the death penalty is that, remember, God is the only one who has authority over life, but God dictated in the Old Testament certain situations in which the death penalty was to be meted out. And therefore, following God's instructions about life, the death penalty is appropriate for those crimes that God had authorized it for. Similarly, war is another one of these situations where, we know God authorized war in Scripture. And interestingly enough, if you read Thomas Aquinas, Aquinas will discuss his doctrine of war. Augustine's important here too with just war theory. Aquinas develops it further. But Aquinas puts just war theory under the doctrine of love, which is rather curious. It's not how we think of it. But Aquinas' argument is essentially that if war is conducted in a just manner, it is conducted in defense of life. You conduct a war to protect people. You conduct war to enforce justice, to end oppression. There are a number of reasons that are legitimate causes for war. And under those circumstances, when you conduct the war, you are acting out of love of neighbor and preservation of life. The intent is not to kill the opponent. The intent is for the good that comes from victory, the preservation of life, the ending of oppression, and so on. And this brings up the last one, which is perhaps the most also related to just war here, the idea of homicidal self-defense. In other words, if someone is attacking me and is threatening to kill me, or attacking someone else and is going to kill them, if the only way I have of stopping that person is to kill them, is it justified? And the answer that, again, Aquinas comes up with is yes, because of something he calls double effect. Double effect says that in that situation of homicidal self-defense, my intent is not to kill the person. My intent is to preserve my life for the life of another person, which fits in with that we must act to preserve life. If the only way to do that is to kill the attacker, then that's justified. My intent is not to kill them. My intent is to preserve life. Okay. So that's the way they thought through that. And again, a similar kind of reasoning applies to war. Okay, so in any event, the point here being that life as an unalienable right raises a lot of complicated questions. It's not quite as simple as we sometimes make it out to be. And the ethical thinking that went into a lot of this actually gets quite complex and quite sophisticated. Next slide. The next unalienable right, life was recognized by the Romans. Liberty to some extent was, but it was developed further under the medieval theologians. Liberty is another one of these unalienable rights. And we have to define liberty because it's not a word we use very often anymore. It's kind of an old-fashioned word. When I was in school, I was told that liberty was an old-fashioned word for freedom. And that's only marginally true. Because what we mean by the word freedom is very different from what they meant by the word liberty. Okay. So what is liberty? Liberty is the freedom to act within the bounds set by natural and divine law. Liberty is the freedom to act within the boundaries set by natural and divine law. Now, what that means is you have a certain scope of freedom of action. You can make decisions and you can act within a certain set of boundaries, within a certain set of conditions. But there are places you cannot go because if you do that, if you transgress those boundaries, you are no longer acting within the boundaries of liberty. In fact, the idea that there are no boundaries or that we can freely cross boundaries was not known as liberty, it was known as license. License, in this sense, is the root of our word licentious. It means acting without boundaries. It means acting, ignoring the bounds of natural or divine law. So liberty only exists when there are boundary conditions, when there are lines you are not allowed to cross. Now, this is radically different from our notion of freedom today. Today, when we talk about freedom, we typically mean nobody can tell me what to do. You don't have the right to restrict my behavior. I can do whatever I want to. Maybe we add the boundary condition as long as I'm not hurting anybody else, but that is really kind of a slippery condition. You will notice, by the way, that I also mentioned it's not just divine law, it's not just what God tells us, it's what he tells us through natural law. So things, behaviors that violate natural law are also outside the bounds of liberty. I'll let you think about that one a little bit. That's got some rather direct implications for us today. Mostly what we think of, though, as freedom in our world is license. Now, the curious thing is there is no political thinker that ever said there is a natural right to license. Natural right to liberty, yes. Natural right to license, no. Because that is a recipe for anarchy and chaos. Now, if liberty is a God-given right, where do we see it? We find it in Eden. Where? Well, God tells Adam and Eve, he puts them in the garden, tend and protect the garden, and eat the fruit of any tree you like in the garden. You got a wide range of things. Apples, peaches, pears, plums, cherries, any fruit tree in the garden that you want to eat, have at it, except that one over there. The exception, that one over there, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is the boundary condition that makes this liberty. Without that boundary condition, without that exception, there is no liberty. Liberty depends on there being that condition there. So we see now again, this was discussed by the Romans, but the way as Christians began to study this and think about this and how do we understand liberty, what does this mean? that was the thing that they sort of realized, that liberty, as the definition develops to the point where I just gave it to you, they saw that in the garden and the tree as being really the critical factor there. So again, it is granted by God. No one can take away your liberty arbitrarily. Now, I should note that this also ties in with where we began, with the idea of religious liberty. You need to have religious liberty for freedom of worship, because without that, worship isn't pleasing to God. So religious liberty comes in here as well. The boundary condition there, you can't do anything that is going to be socially disruptive. You can't have a religion that has you rioting in the streets. There were some of those in Rome. You can't have a religion that violates natural law. Okay. You can't have you can't have a religion that uses human sacrifice. There are a series of boundary conditions, but religious liberty fits in here as well. This is where that ties in. Now, the third unalienable right that was recognized in the Middle Ages, and this was the hardest one, is the right to property. And ironically enough, the right to property really, the theory for the right to property really came from the Franciscans. Now, the Franciscans are a religious order, I mentioned this before, who believed in apostolic poverty, who believed that the apostles, Jesus and the apostles, owned nothing, and that if we wanted to live a true apostolic lifestyle, we needed to give up all of our possessions as well. Probably the best example of this that I can think of is there was a movie that came out some years ago called The Name of the Rose. And it's a murder mystery, and there's a bunch of other things going on in it. But part of the context is a debate between the Franciscans and representatives of the Pope over apostolic poverty. And at the beginning of it, when you're getting to this debate, the leader of the Franciscans stands up and says, the eyes of good Christians around the world are upon us as we meet in this monastery to consider the vexing question, did Christ or did Christ not own the clothes he wore? And the audience starts laughing because, well, it's kind of a stupid question. But as a sort of medievalist, I thought it was actually brilliant writing, because that is a really good shorthand for the actual debate that the Franciscans were having with the Pope. Did they own their property? Did they own what they wore? Did they own their food? Did they own any of these things? Because the Franciscans initially, the more radical Franciscans initially said, no, they didn't. Now, the Pope, a very, very wealthy office, didn't really like this line of reasoning. And one of the popes said, okay, so talk to me about bread. And the Franciscan said, well, we don't own bread, we just use it. Just like we don't own our clothes or anything else, we just use them. The Pope says, okay, wait a minute. You have this loaf of bread, you eat it, it disappears. It becomes part of you. How is it that you don't own that bread? Well, how is this different from anybody else? And the Franciscans sort of scratched their head and said, yeah, he's got a point there. And so they began to develop a theory of property rights that distinguished, essentially, it distinguished between unalienable property rights. We have the right to bread because we need it to live, and so it's connected to our right to life. But then there's unalienable stuff that we don't need to live that we can freely give away. No one can take it away from us arbitrarily, but those things we can give away. We can't give away our right to the things that we need to live. But other than that, we can do this. So they're the first ones who actually start developing this idea of an unalienable right to property, ironically enough, like I said, connected to the right to life. Now, the right to property is going to be preserved as we move into the early modern period with Locke. He's going to have a totally different and I think far more effective argument for it. But again, we'll get to that when we get to Locke tomorrow. Okay, so this takes us really to the end of the Middle Ages. So let me give you, let me try to tie a little bit of this together for you. Unfortunately, that's difficult to do because in a lot of ways, all of these things, the discussion of natural rights is a topic that doesn't really touch in the Middle Ages on the topic of government. What is the relationship between the two? They never really talk about that. The relationship of church and state ties into government, but it doesn't tie into natural rights. The idea of corruptibility of government and the need for limitations on it, checks and balances, intermediate institutions, all of those things, most of these things don't touch each other. I mean, there's a little bit of overlap because we've been talking about government, so a lot of these things land in government, but natural rights don't, except in the sense that in the abstract, the government can't take them away from you. It's not going to be until later on that all of these different threads, all of these different themes get pulled together into a coherent system. Actually, that's going to wait until after the Reformation. We'll be seeing that when we get to this tomorrow. But again, we need to get the pieces on the board in order to see how they work together later on. So what do we have here? Again, just a quick review. Liberty of conscience, religious liberty. We have limited government checks and balances because of original sin. Moving it a bit out of order, we have Aristotle with a potential for a positive view of government, government as performing the positive thing in society, as well as these various forms of government that he outlines. That and Augustine and the pessimism kind of work together. We have the question of the relationship of church and state. How do those things balance each other? And then we have this issue of unalienable natural rights, which is going to be really critical when it comes to determining, ultimately, when does government overstep its bounds? When does government actually turn tyrannical? When does government go from a good government to a bad government? Well, part of the answer is going to be when it starts trampling on the unalienable rights of the people. So again, these are all the pieces on the playing board. We'll tie them together tomorrow with a couple of new things coming in out of the Reformation.